There's a specific kind of discomfort that doesn't come from anything wrong in the obvious sense. You can still function. You can still talk, work, respond, smile at the right moments. Nothing has collapsed in a way that would justify the feeling. And yet, the inside of your life feels slightly out of tune, like a song you've heard 1,000 times suddenly played in the wrong key. It's hard to name because it doesn't arrive as a clear problem. It arrives as dissonance, a low psychological tension between who you've been and what you can feel beginning to form. It's not dramatic, it's not always painful. It can even be quiet. But once you notice it, it sits there, like something in you is no longer fully persuaded by the life you're living. That's why it can feel like confusion rather than clarity. Clarity would be easier. Confusion at least has a story attached to it, something the mind can chase and fix. This doesn't. It's more like the old way of making sense of things isn't holding. You go to reach for your usual explanations, and they don't quite land. The sentences still exist, but they don't carry weight. You might find yourself thinking, nothing is wrong, yet nothing feels right. And the mind hates that kind of statement because it can't solve it. It wants something concrete, something you can point to, a reason you can defend. But dissonance isn't a courtroom argument. It's the nervous system and identity drifting out of alignment. Usually, the first instinct is to tighten, to become more disciplined, more rational, more controlled, to prove to yourself that you're fine. And for a while, you might succeed at that. You might even become more efficient, more composed. People might compliment how strong you seem. But inside, the dissonance doesn't respond to performance. It responds to truth. And truth, when it starts emerging, doesn't always emerge as a confident statement. It emerges as a quiet inability to keep pretending. When identity begins dissolving, the mind often reacts with fear before it reacts with understanding. Not because something terrible is happening, but because your internal reference points start fading. The old anchors that once told you who you are and what matters begin to loosen. The ego experiences that loosening as danger. Ego panic is rarely loud at first. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the sudden urge to explain yourself more than usual, the impulse to reach for certainty in conversations, the need to categorize what you're feeling quickly so it doesn't stay ambiguous for too long. It can show up as irritability, not because you're angry at anyone, but because your internal system is trying to stabilize itself by clinging to something familiar. The mind interprets transition as threat because transition removes the map. Even if the terrain you're entering is better suited for you, the lack of a familiar map feels unsafe. That's why anxiety can spike during identity erosion. It isn't necessarily fear of your life falling apart. It's fear of not knowing who you are while it rearranges. And the strange part is that the anxiety can arrive even when nothing external has changed. That's what makes it feel irrational. But it isn't irrational. It's protective. The ego doesn't know how to live without being in charge, so it raises alarms the moment it senses its authority weakening. This is also where people misread the discomfort as chaos. But it isn't chaos. It's a system realizing it can't run the old program anymore. The discomfort is the ego recognizing it's no longer needed in the same way, and it doesn't want to accept that yet. There's another symptom that often follows, and it's one of the most misunderstood: emotional flatness. Not depression necessarily, not sadness, more like reduced emotional reactivity. The highs don't hit the same. The lows might still come, but they feel different too, less sharp, more distant. Sometimes it feels like your emotions are behind glass. You can see what you're supposed to feel, but you can't fully access it. This can scare people because they interpret it as losing themselves. They think something has shut down. They assume they're becoming numb, indifferent, broken. But emotional flatness can also be a pause. A nervous system doesn't recalibrate in the middle of constant stimulation. Sometimes it has to quiet things down first. It has to reduce output. It has to stop reacting automatically, so there's space for a new baseline to form. Flatness, in that sense, isn't emptiness. It's preparation. It creates room. And room is uncomfortable when you're used to living in constant inner noise. If you're honest, you may notice that the flatness isn't total. It's selective. Certain things still affect you. Certain moments still pierce through. But what's fading is your emotional loyalty to the old structure, the old motivations, the old rewards, the old reasons you used to lean on when life felt unclear. That's often where the next shock arrives. Old motivations stop working, sometimes all at once. You sit down to chase something you used to want, and the wanting isn't there. Or it's there in words only. The mind can list the benefits, the logic, the long-term payoff, but the body doesn't move. The internal ignition doesn't catch. It can feel like losing ambition, like losing discipline, like you've become someone who can't commit. But there's a more precise explanation, and it's less insulting. The rewards that used to move you belong to the old self. When identity shifts, the reward system shifts with it. What used to activate you, approval, achievement, external validation, even certain types of comfort, may stop producing the same internal response. Not because those things are inherently worthless, but because your system no longer believes they will deliver what they promised. You can't motivate a nervous system with a reward it no longer trusts. So you try to force it. You try to manufacture drive. You try to restart the old engine with the same fuel, and it backfires. It creates resistance, heaviness, that particular fatigue that comes not from effort, but from effort that feels dishonest. This is why just push through starts sounding like an insult in this phase. Not because pushing is always wrong, but because you can feel the difference between clean effort and self-erasure. Clean effort has strain, but it also has coherence. Self-erasure has strain and a quiet nausea, like something in you is being overridden. And when you override yourself long enough, your system starts refusing. That refusal is often mislabeled as weakness, but sometimes it's honesty. Sometimes it's self-respect trying to emerge in the only way it can at first, by not cooperating. This is where procrastination becomes complicated, because not all resistance is fear. Some resistance is disagreement. Some resistance is the part of you that knows the old path no longer belongs to you, even if you can't articulate what the new path is yet. And once that happens, you begin questioning everything you never questioned before. Not as a philosophy hobby, as a symptom. Certainty dissolves. Assumptions you live by unconsciously start collapsing under scrutiny. You notice the scripts, the inherited beliefs, the rules you followed without remembering who wrote them. You start hearing your own thoughts differently, as if you can finally tell which ones are yours and which ones are borrowed. This can feel destabilizing. People around you might call it overthinking. You might even call it that, if you're trying to dismiss it. But it isn't always instability. It can be awakening, though even that word can sound too clean, too finished. It's more like the old answers no longer survive contact with your current awareness. You ask yourself why you want what you want, why you do what you do, why certain things matter. And the most uncomfortable part is that the answers don't come immediately. The mind expects new clarity the moment old certainty dissolves, but often, the mind has to sit in unanswered space for a while. And that space is where the dissonance deepens. Nothing feels wrong enough to justify quitting your life. Nothing feels right enough to keep giving yourself to it in the same way. You're still here, still participating, but something inside you is stepping back and watching. The version of you that made sense of life is no longer fully in charge. And that's why everything feels slightly unfamiliar, even when the world hasn't changed. If you stay with it long enough, you start noticing that the discomfort isn't asking you to panic. It's asking you to stop using old certainty as a substitute for truth. It's asking you to tolerate the in-between without immediately rushing to define it. That's not a satisfying request. It doesn't make a great story. It doesn't give quick relief. But it is often the beginning of something real, and it rarely begins with feeling strong. And the mind will keep trying to interpret what's happening as a problem, because a problem implies a solution. A solution implies control. But this phase doesn't behave like a puzzle. It behaves like erosion, like an old internal structure losing integrity before anything new is built. This is why the in-between can feel unbearable. Not because it's objectively worse than what came before, but because your usual reference points aren't reliable anymore. You reach for certainty the way you reach for a familiar light switch, and the room stays dim. You reach for the old explanations, and they sound like someone else's voice. You reach for the old motivation, and nothing in you answers. It can feel like you're becoming unstable when, in reality, you're becoming less programmable. There's a subtle difference between "I don't know" as confusion and "I don't know" as honesty. Confusion is noisy. It spins. It creates urgency. Honesty is quieter. It just sits there. You may find yourself living with more of that quiet "I don't know" than you ever have before. And the mind hates it because it can't weaponize it into action. So it panics, sometimes softly, sometimes not. It starts scanning for danger. It starts treating unfamiliar inner states as threats. It says something is wrong because you don't feel like yourself. It says this can't be good because you can't explain it neatly. It says you need to get back to normal. But normal was often just the old self maintaining control, and control is what's dissolving. That doesn't mean you're losing your mind. It means the part of you that needed to define reality in order to feel safe is losing authority. The ego doesn't step aside gracefully. It tightens first. It makes noise. It throws anxiety like a flare. Not because it knows you're doomed, but because it senses it's no longer necessary in the same way. Anxiety spikes during identity erosion for this exact reason. It's not always about the future. It's not always about failure. It's often about losing the internal structure that used to filter everything for you. The mind is used to being the narrator. When it can't narrate cleanly, it calls it danger, and the body picks up the signal. You might notice a restlessness that doesn't connect to any clear external stressor, or a hyper-awareness that feels almost like you're waiting for something to happen. Or the opposite, a dullness that makes everything feel slightly muted. The nervous system pauses before recalibration. It reduces output. It gets quiet in order to reorganize. That quiet can be misunderstood as emotional failure. You look at your own flatness and think you're broken. You judge yourself for not feeling more, for not caring the way you used to, for not being grateful. But flatness isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's your system pulling the plug on unnecessary reactivity so it can rebuild a more stable baseline. Reduced emotional reactivity creates space, but space doesn't always feel like freedom. Space can feel like exposure. Because when the emotional noise fades, you begin hearing other things. Small truths you used to drown out. Small contradictions you used to tolerate. The way certain relationships leave you tense afterward. The way certain ambitions make your stomach tighten, even if your mind calls them good. The way your body reacts before your explanations arrive. This is one of the most disorienting parts. Nothing feels wrong enough to justify the shift, yet nothing feels right enough to ignore it. You can still function, you can still meet obligations, but it costs you more to participate in the old way. It's like your system has raised the price on anything that requires you to become someone you no longer are. That's why old motivations can stop working all at once. One day you wake up, and the things that used to move you don't. The goals still exist. The habits are still available. The old rewards still look shiny. But you reach for them and feel a strange neutrality. Not disgust, not anger, just no ignition. The collapse of dopamine-based motivation can feel like losing your will, but it's often losing belief in the reward. You can't motivate a nervous system that no longer believes in what it's being asked to chase. That's the hard part to accept, because it means discipline won't save you in the same way it used to. Discipline can push you through discomfort. It can't manufacture meaning. It can't convincingly pretend. Not for long. Especially not when your identity has shifted and the old ambition belongs to a past version of you. This is why forcing motivation backfires. You try to resurrect the old drive and it feels like dragging a body. It creates a heavier kind of fatigue, the kind that isn't from effort, but from resistance. The kind that leaves you a little more disconnected from yourself each time you override that inner no. And the resistance you feel might not be weakness. It might be honesty. This is where the mind gets confused and starts calling everything procrastination. But procrastination isn't always fear of doing something hard. Sometimes it's the soul-level refusal to build a life around something that no longer reflects you. Sometimes avoidance is internal disagreement. Sometimes you're not avoiding effort, you're avoiding betrayal. Fear-based resistance and deeper refusal can feel similar on the surface. Both can stall you. Both can look like not moving. But the texture is different. Fear feels sharp, urgent, full of catastrophic storylines. Deeper refusal feels flat, steady, almost quiet, like a door that won't open no matter how much you push. Not because you lack strength, because you're pushing in the wrong direction. That's why pushing through can feel heavier than stopping. Stopping feels frightening because it removes the story of who you are, the achiever, the striver, the one with a plan, the one with a goal. When those identities fade, there's a gap where nothing feels stable. And there is always a gap between selves. People don't talk about it much because it's not pretty. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't sound impressive. It's just the in-between, the place where you can't fully return to who you were, and you can't yet claim who you're becoming. The place where your old answers no longer survive scrutiny, and your new answers haven't arrived. Certainty dissolves here. Assumptions you live by unconsciously begin collapsing. You start questioning things you never questioned before, not as a hobby, but as a symptom of waking up inside your own life. You ask yourself why you want what you want, who you became for, what you've been obeying, what you've been trying to prove. The mind looks for clean answers and finds silence. That silence can be misread as instability, but questioning isn't always a sign that you're breaking. Sometimes it's the first sign that you're becoming real. Answers don't come immediately because answers are often built on identity, and identity is still dissolving. You can't get a new map while you're still letting go of the old one. And rushing clarity usually recreates the old self, because the old self is the one who knew how to be certain. So the gap asks something uncomfortable. Stay present without identity. Not in a spiritual slogan way, in a bodily way, in a day-to-day way, where you do what needs to be done, but you stop forcing your inner life to pretend it knows exactly what this means. You let the uncertainty exist without turning it into an emergency. You let the flatness exist without making it a verdict. You let the questioning exist without demanding immediate resolution. This is where the nothing feels right feeling begins to make sense in a different way. Nothing feels right because the old self is fading. The version of you that used to make sense of life is no longer in charge. And without that old interpreter running the show, the world can feel slightly unfamiliar. Even your own life can feel slightly unfamiliar. You're standing inside the same circumstances with a different internal lens, and the mismatch is what creates the tension. That tension isn't a sign you're lost. It's a sign the old structure can't hold your reality anymore. And when that structure dissolves, it can feel like losing yourself. But what if it isn't loss? What if it's subtraction? Growth often feels like losing yourself at first, because the first thing growth removes is what isn't you. The old conditioning, the borrowed ambition, the performance-based identity, the reflexive need to be understood. the habit of converting every feeling into a plan. Subtraction is quiet. It doesn't arrive as an addition of new certainty. It arrives as a removal of old noise. And because it's removal, it can feel like emptiness. But emptiness isn't always a lack. Sometimes it's space that has been reclaimed. The mind wants you to fill it immediately, with a new goal, a new identity, a new explanation you can repeat until it feels true again. But forcing replacement too early is how you keep yourself trapped in recycling. The old self dissolves, and you rebuild it with a new coat of paint. This is why the only sane move in this phase is a certain kind of trust. Not optimism, not blind faith. Trust as in allowing the fade without forcing a substitute, not interfering. Non-interference doesn't mean you stop caring about your life. It means you stop manipulating your inner process into something it isn't ready to be. It means you stop trying to pressure yourself back into an ambition that has already expired. It means you stop demanding that the next self show up fully formed on your timeline. You may still feel the urge to do that, especially on days when the gap feels too wide, especially when you look around and realize you can't explain who you are becoming yet, especially when the ego flares and calls the whole thing dangerous. But if you can hold the gap without rushing to close it, something quiet becomes possible. Not a dramatic rebirth, not an instant new identity, just a little more honesty, a little more alignment, a little less self-override, a little less compulsion to prove that you're okay, a little less urgency to make this phase look like progress. And eventually, you start noticing that the "nothing feels right" sensation isn't random. It's precise. It's pointing to what no longer fits. It's withdrawing energy from what was built on the old self. It's clearing the room, not to punish you, to make space for the real one to finally emerge.